This presentation is about the problems-based learning method. In the presentation, we'll take a look at some of the contextual factors that teachers need to consider when implementing the problems-based learning method in their classroom. Also, what are some of the concerns about using the problems-based learning method? What are the advantages of using problems-based learning as a tool in the classroom? What does the data suggest in regards to student learning? What advantages and perhaps shortcomings does problems-based learning present to students? And then some extended discussion questions at the end regarding problems-based learning. What should we consider as the future of problems-based learning unfolds as potential opportunities for teachers and students? So as a method, problems-based learning can be highly effective in the classroom, but there are some things that certainly the teacher needs to consider before they implement problems-based learning. Like any good method, problems-based learning is going to require some considerable teacher preparation before bringing in the classroom and asking students to engage with the materials. Some of the things that teachers may need to consider, for instance, if we look at this list of bulleted items, what type of problem are they going to be asking students to consider? Is it going to be a real-world problem, or is it going to be a simulated problem? Kind of depending on the content that you may be teaching. Real-world problems obviously present this level of relevance that we're always seeking in our classrooms. However, they also present perhaps limited data from which students can sort through or learn from. Simulated problems tend to be a little bit safer. Certainly they are also a little bit more teacher-directed. You can have the data in place. So if we compare problems-based learning to, let's say, inquiry, real problems or real-world problems are like open inquiry questions, whereas simulated problems are more like the guided inquiry questions. Do you ask students to collaborate on these problems, or will they work independently? Certainly, problems-based learning lends itself to another very popular teaching model or method, cooperative learning. So this would be an opportunity for students to not only solve something that could be extraordinarily relevant to them, but they could do it through collaborative measures that certainly will be skills that they will be developing in the future as well. Breadth versus depth is always an issue regarding content, and certainly problems-based learning can really ask students to go very deeply in unpacking the problem as well as potential solutions. But the one thing that content that requires that depth and enrichment also compromises time, and time is something that is very sacred oftentimes in our classroom. So this is really something that a teacher needs to consider prior to bringing problems-based methodology in their classroom. What role is the teacher going to assume? Is the teacher going to be a facilitator? Are they going to be the resource manager? And it may be less about which role and more about when will they serve that role, because a teacher, quite frankly, could be all three. A facilitator as teams are collaboratively working together, a resource manager and helping them find resources, particularly if they're dealing with a problem that, again, may be something that's campus-based, for instance, and have a little bit of a level of confidentiality. And certainly we're not asking teachers to navigate or compromise any level of professionalism, but being able to access specific information that maybe the students wouldn't have access to. So being a facilitator or resource manager or teaching the content, there's always a level of content necessary for students to be able to begin developing solutions to specific problems. Differentiation, certainly problems-based learning kind of shifts differentiation from student or from teacher responsibility to student responsibility, which is exactly what you're hoping to achieve in your classroom. Making choices about next situation as teachers can transition that to students, certainly the level of differentiation increases. Again, the problem, how much ownership do we allow the students to assume with the problem? Are we going to allow students to select the problem? Are they going to be self-selected? Service learning projects, for instance, are excellent extended examples of problems-based learning, and oftentimes are very fruitful if students select those service learning projects themselves. However, depending on the age group, obviously that would be something that is a factor that needs to be considered by the teacher. And then the scope of the problem. Is it a local problem? Is it a regional problem? Is it a national or global problem? The broader the problem, for instance, global or national problem, the probably more data that's available. If it's a local issue, it may be more anecdotal, where students go out and collect data themselves, which is a great level of authenticity, but it also depends on age level, grade level, and perhaps the content. So these are some of the contextual things that teachers consider, and certainly the list is not necessarily complete, but these are some very important factors when regarding problems-based learning as a method to bring into the classroom. Some of the concerns with problems-based learning, and similar to the previous bulleted list, this list may not be completely comprehensive, but these are some things that teachers need to consider as we're working with problems-based learning in the classroom. How much does the teacher know about the problem? And this, again, goes back to that level of ownership. Certainly the teachers, if it is a self-selected kind of local or maybe even regional problem, the teacher is not necessarily expected to be an expert on every single problem that the student groups or a student may select. What the teacher probably does need to be an expert regarding would be the resources and the research level and the data, or at least helping students be able to access and organize that data. Now, if it's a content-driven problem, then the teacher may assume a level of mastery that they would not assume if it were maybe perhaps a student-selected problem. So, and teachers sometimes are very reluctant to bring in things into the classroom that they feel that they don't have a firm mastery of. That would be where I would really encourage teachers to explore and experiment with this particular method, and that you don't have to be a master of all things. Like I say, for problems-based learning, really it's about helping students research and organize and then develop a solution to these particular problems, and then measure those solutions, finding measurements and assessments that would validate their solutions or invalidate their solutions. The resources, again, if you're going to be a resource manager, if you're going to have technology available, certainly that's something that in local and regional and national and global problems, the more technology and that's accessible, the probably more enriched the research regarding the data collection, readings, as well as class time, access to experts. These are some things that perhaps the teacher needs to resource for students. Organizing student thinking. As with inquiry, one of the most important things is helping students organize their data. Essentially, very similar to that, you're helping students organize their thinking regarding the problem. Let's say it's a local problem that has a really rich source of information and data. But some of it is objective and some of it is very subjective, and I think the teacher is going to have to help that group of students or that student organize and wade through the data and mine the data and figure out what is the data that is relevant to their solution development. What type of assessment are we going to use in the classroom in order to measure problems-based learning. And really, problems-based learning presents a level of authenticity that some of the other methods may not. So this lends itself to authentic assessment as well. But you want some checkpoints, because problems-based learning is usually one of those methods that takes several class periods, maybe even several weeks to accomplish. So you want a level of assessment to not only provide feedback, but help students be accountable for progress. So those are some things to consider as well. How much class time? As I said, time is usually sacred for teachers, and problems-based learning can be a time-consuming method, but it can also be a very enriched, cross-curricular, in-depth, content-specific method. So it's not something that requires you to compromise or sacrifice depth of content. The advantages of problem-based learning are the fact that students are highly engaged and they're thinking at a high level. We're always looking for those methods and models that not only engage students but promote a level of critical thinking that pushes student cognition, and certainly problems-based learning is that method. It also gives them a sense of ownership of the curriculum. When we talk about differentiation usually is about choice, and allowing students to really have that level of control over their learning is very rewarding and empowering for students. So there's a significant number of advantages to problems-based learning, and it not only does it, again, authenticate learning for a lot of the students, but it presents a level of relevancy that will be extremely important, that I think pushes them to lifelong learning, and that is quintessential in what we want to establish in our classrooms. As you look at this list, the data presents, again, a level of engagement and a level of thinking, but more specifically, it also allows students a level of communication and collaboration that maybe they haven't had in the past. They're going to negotiate problems together. They're going to negotiate internal team issues as well. They're going to share work. They're going to be able to determine strengths and weaknesses. And certainly there's always that writing component, so pushing a level of critical writing along with critical thinking. So there's really a lot of different variables that are the income and the outcome of problems-based learning. So it's not just about differentiation and ownership of student learning, but there are some really cross-curricular connections that could be made, whether it be verbal articulation, written articulation, or just understanding relationships that conceptually may otherwise be isolated within the content. Some of the extended discussion from the research on problems-based learning poses the idea that it, again, authenticates the content, allowing students to engage with relevant issues. And for some, that is extremely powerful, whereas with others, depending on their style of learning, that may be more of a challenge. They're very accustomed to things that are quite traditional in the classroom, and problems-based learning really starts to challenge some of the traditional components of classroom content. Also, we as teachers are always trying to push students to extend their thinking, and we have sometimes, unfortunately, created classrooms that are more of a vacuum of learning rather than a push of higher level thinking. So, and students get accustomed to that. And all of a sudden you bring in a method like problems-based learning that requires them to not only engage, but engage in something that's very significant to them. And it seems like, well, this is logical. They're going to really, this is going to challenge them to really be involved, and rather than them being involved, they tend to start withdrawing because they're just not accustomed to that. So there may be a reconditioning that the teacher has to go through with some of the students because they're just not accustomed to something that brings them as personally involved as problems-based learning may. Certainly the critical thinking and critical writing is a significant product. I think, again, it goes back to authentic assessment. How do we deal with this? As a teacher, what can we do to maybe extend this in other curricular areas? This may allow teachers to collaborate cross-curricularly and come up with some very authentic problems that are addressed in almost every core content area. Certainly, as students solve their own problems, they become very confident in their own abilities. I think this is something that the research supports as a very significant outcome for problems-based learning, is that students not only own part of their learning, but they also become very self-aware of the fact that they contributed to the solution or a solution to a very serious problem. So that alone, I think, helps to endorse the lifelong learning that we're looking for in our classrooms. So as a conclusion to the presentation, I want you to look at the last two questions that really it says it's focused on social studies and science, but you can think broader than that. This presentation was focused primarily on social sciences and science curriculum, but certainly problems-based learning is not isolated just to those content areas. So if you're from a different content area, certainly expand this into your field, your area of expertise, and consider a response to the two problems. If it is highly effective, why is it a challenge for teachers to use? That's simply the first question. Secondly, because it is a time-consuming method, how can we condense it and still it be effective and efficient? So as we look at the research on problems-based learning, and as we consider bringing it into our classroom as a highly engaging, highly effective, differentiated method for student learning, how can we condense it to make it efficient and effective?